Hello, and welcome to the first of our video. I wouldn't call them lectures, more like a video lesson, I guess. They won't be that long. They're designed to be kind of a sort of truncated version of what you might get in a class discussion on these topics. But since it's kind of hard to concentrate on a sort of video for an hour and 20 minutes or something, I try to keep them short and snappy. And today we're going to be discussing narrative, and particularly narrative as it relates to the three assigned readings you've already had, which are Hawthorne's The Birthmark, Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, and Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. Now, you've all read these stories already, and you've also submitted some work on them, either forum posts or critical writing assignments, and that asked you to think about the question of narrative with using some of the materials posted to the Moodle page as guidance. And I just wanted to kind of backtrack a little bit and now give you my take on what, not just how to identify types of narrative, but also how different types of narrative can impact how we experience a work of fiction. Now, fiction, the word fiction, as we know, means something fake or made up. But in a literary context, the definition is a little more specific. When we talk about fiction, we're talking about narrative storytelling. That is, storytelling, written storytelling that uses a narrator to convey information. And the narrator's voice, the narrator is a voice within a text that is distinct from the voice of the author, right? That it's not the author who's talking to us. It is rather a kind of invented voice, but it can come in different forms. And as you've seen, the narrator of Cask of Amontillado is very different from the narrator of Hills Like White Elephants, etc. The nature of those differences is something I want to talk a little bit more about today. So here we have our Moodle page, and you can see a lot of stuff here on my page that you can't see on your page. It's because I have it in instructor view. Maybe I should switch to student view just so it's not confusing here. Maybe I won't bother doing that because the little window is obscuring my view to a certain extent. Now we're somewhere we definitely don't want to be. But of course, I did give you this handout on narration and point of view, which is actually an excerpt from the usual textbook for this class, which is the Norton Introduction to Literature. And hopefully you got a chance to look at this because it does give you the basics, the key information you need to think about narrative voice. And essentially we have three different categories of narration that are categorized according to grammatical person, the same way you would categorize a pronoun. And of course, it's a first-person narrative, third-person narrative, and second-person narrative, which is much rarer. Third-person narration is the most common type. And they list that first in the book. I'm going to come back to that, though. Just talk about first-person narration for a second. Based on your forum post responses to the Cask of Amontillado reading, it seems like most of you understand what a first-person narrator basically is. It's the I narrator, right? It's a narrator who's a first-person narrator is a narrator who is also a character in the story, right? So they're speaking from within the events, and they're an identifiable figure in the narrative. And in Cask of Amontillado, of course, that narrator is Montresor, who is both our narrator and also kind of our central character. And then we have third-person narrator, which in a third-person narrative, right, the narrator is a external observer, somebody who's not actually, it's not actually even a person, right? It's a sort of abstract voice, the text calls it an unidentified listener, or the third-person narrator is virtually always external, right? Narrator is not a character in the story and does not participate in its action. And typically, in almost every case, it's an abstraction. It's not any kind of figure you can identify, right? It's not a person per se or a character. It's just a voice. And the third-person narration, though, is more complicated than first-person narrator, because third-person narration can be subdivided into these subcategories, which is something I want to talk about today as well. So let's just touch on first-person narrative first. There's a third category, by the way, second-person narrative. which is quite rare. We're not even going to get any examples of it today. But a first-person narrative, of course, uses I. A third-person narrative is built around third-person pronouns and proper names. They did this, she did that, or using the character's name, right? A second-person narrative, as the name implies, is a narrative that's built on the pronoun you. So, and it's very rarely used in fiction, in serious literary fiction. So as you can see, second-person narrators who consistently speak to you are unusual, but it has the effect of turning the reader into a character in the story, basically. And the one place where you kind of encounter this a lot is maybe in, well, let's see. When I was a kid, we had these choose your own adventure novels, right? They'd ask you to make choices as you were going through the book. You find yourself standing in a hallway. There's a door at the end of the hallway and a window in the wall. Do you want to go out the door or use the window? And you'd make a choice and turn to that page, and it would address you as if you were a character in the story. I don't know if those books still exist. I assume they still do in some form. They were pretty fun. But I haven't seen one in years and years and years. But we're not going to worry too much about second-person narration because we're not actually going to look at any of it, and it's pretty rare. So let's come back to first-person narration for a second. And we all know that a first-person narrative is an I narrative. So let's pull up Cask of Amontillado for a second and just talk a little bit about what the effect of this is, right? Let's see, the Cask of Amontillado. Here you are, reading number 1, Edgar Allan Poe, The Cask of Amontillado. So hopefully you can see what's on my screen. Supposedly this is recording everything I'm doing on my screen. And I couldn't figure out how to do this on WebEx, so I had to pay for something myself to do it. Whatever. So here's the opening, the very famous opening of Cask of Amontillado, right? The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. Very famous opening. But right away, of course, the text immediately identifies itself as a first-person narrative, right? Somebody speaking, I, right? A character within the story is addressing himself as I. You're inside the head of one of the characters directly, and they're relating to you what is happening in the story. Now, I'm not going to go through the text and do a whole close reading of this story, right? This is not a good format for that kind of thing. But what are the implications of the fact that Cask of Amontillado is written in this first-person narrative? You could easily change, the technical differences between first-person narrative and third-person narrative are simple, right? It's just a question of what kind of pronouns the narrator is using and, the point of view. So you could easily change this first sentence to be third person, right? The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato, Montresor had borne as best he could, but when Fortunato ventured upon insult, Montresor vowed revenge. Not nearly as snappy, right? Doesn't nearly pull you in the same way as the first person version, where you can really feel Montresor's anger. But of course, this is a story about a killing, right? There's basically two characters. One guy kills the other guy, and it's pretty simple, right? In terms of plot, in terms of character. But there are some pretty powerful implications to the story being told in the first person from Montresor's point of view, right? You who so well know the nature of my soul will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitively settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. There's a lot going on there in that first paragraph, but essentially what Montresor is saying is, I wanted to get even with Fortunato, and I wanted to do it in such a way that I wouldn't get caught, right? I wanted to do it with impunity. But there's a lot that Montresor doesn't tell us, including the most important thing, right? This is ostensibly a revenge story, right? And we know it's a revenge story because Montresor tells us it's a revenge story, right? I vowed revenge. But what exactly is he getting revenge for? If you read the story, you were probably bothered by the fact that it's never made clear what it is that Fortunato did to Montresor. And in fact, the very idea, the very notion that Montresor is getting even with Fortunato for something in a kind of um, retaliatory way, or what's the word I'm looking for? Um, Geez, the older I get, the more this happens. Um, well, in a way that is that he's doing something that is sort of deserved in some way, right? That is warranted by the actions that Fortunato took against him. We only have Montresor's word for that, and we don't have any details. And what that shows about first person narrative, of course, is that you were very strongly biased toward the perspective of one of the characters, because there is nothing in life that happens that is purely objective, right? Every single thing that we experience, maybe I don't want to overstate it, but almost everything that we experience, right, is shot through with our subjective responses to those things. So somebody does something to you, you think it's rude, you're offended by it, there's some subjectivity in that, right? Because maybe the person who you think was really rude to them, they were just being normal or whatever, or matter of fact or friendly. It happens all the time, which is why hey, quiet, my dog is scratching at the door of the office. He wants to come in. Shh, I'm working here. I'm not going to start the video over again though, so we're just going to roll with it. For example, you have two friends that get into an argument, right? Friend A and friend B. Friend A calls you on the phone the next day and says, "Oh my God, you have to hear what B did to me. It was so terrible, etc., etc. Let's meet for a drink and discuss it." And then the next day, friend B calls you and says, "Oh my God, I have to tell you about what happened with friend A. Can you meet me for coffee so we can talk about it?" Those two friends are not going to tell you the same story. There might be a lot of the same facts in those two stories, but they will be subjectively interpreted in very different ways, because everybody's always the hero of their own story, right? So from Montresor's point of view, he's doing something that is in his mind justified, and because we only have his point of view, we as readers are kind of carried along for that ride. But when you start to question it, you start to realize things don't quite add up, because of course, first of all, Montresor is obviously like a master manipulator, right? We see in the story the way he plays Fortunato like a fiddle, using Fortunato's own kind of pomposity and self-conceit against him, right? Uses things like reverse psychology, right? The whole time he's leading him down to the catacombs, Montresor keeps telling Fortunato, "You should go back, you should go back." Keeps telling Fortunato exactly the opposite of what he wants him to do. And of course it works like a charm, right? "Come," this is the bottom of page 5. "Come," I said with decision, "we will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy, as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Lucchese." "Enough," he said. "The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough." "True, true," I replied. And of course, Montresor knows he's not going to die of a cough. He's going to die from being walled up in the crypts without air or food or water. But here is a good example of Montresor knowing exactly how to get Fortunato to do what he wants him to do without making it seem like it's his idea, right? It's making it seem like Fortunato like he's the one calling the shots. So we see enough here in this interaction to realize that Montresor is very cunning, right? He's got a good sort of grasp of the psychology of the situation. He knows what to say to Fortunato to get him to do what he wants. And he's also cruel enough to enact a revenge that is about as bad as it can get, right? Burying somebody alive. When you combine this sort of intelligence and this cunning with this cruelty, you begin to wonder if maybe Montresor might not be the most reliable of narrators. And this story, Cask of Amontillado, is a good example of what we might call the unreliable narrator. Can we trust what Montresor is telling us? You might think so at first. And this happens a lot when people are telling you about things that happen to them. And they're always saying that, oh, I've been wronged. I'm the good guy. They're the bad guy. And, when we're dealing with people in real life, we quickly learn like which people we can trust to give us a fair approximation of a situation. What kind of people are always feeling persecuted against or paranoid. What could Fortunato possibly have done to make this act of revenge justified? The fact that Fortunato has no clue, that he's willing to follow Montresor into this crypt without any suspicion whatsoever suggests that whatever it is, it's something that only Montresor is aware of. And then very quickly we begin to wonder if we might be dealing with somebody who's not necessarily, well, let me put it this way. When you combine intelligence and charm with cruelty and violence, you begin to think of something almost like the profile of a sociopath, right? Is it possible that instead of giving us a story about revenge, Poe is actually giving us a story about what it's like to be inside the head of somebody crazy, a sociopathic murderer? Though Poe wouldn't have had that word. It's possible, right? We learn at the end of the story that it's been 50 years, right? For half a century, no mortal has disturbed. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In patre requiescat, right? So it's 50 years later now. He's on his deathbed. He's kind of maybe finally telling the story to somebody. We don't know who, maybe a priest, whatever. There are all kinds of textual clues that we might look at in a longer discussion. But basically, right, he doesn't seem remorseful. He doesn't seem to feel bad about this. He's proud of it. But because of the first person narrator, because we are inside Montresor's head and we don't get anybody else's perspective, it's really difficult to kind of pierce the veil of his subjectivity, right? He's telling us what he wants us to know. We're experiencing the story the way he told it. Imagine the story told from Fortunato's point of view, how much different it would be. So that's an example of the power of first person narrative to impact the way we experience the events of a story. Now, I could go on about Cask of Amontillado for half an hour easily, but I want to stop there and I want to talk a little bit about third person narrative. All right, now, third person narrative is, of course, as you know, the external observer and doesn't use I. And the narrator is not a character or not a concrete figure within the story. It's rather an abstract external observer. But of course, as the book tells you, this third person narrative can be subdivided into different types. And the two stories I gave you, Hills Like White Elephants and The Birthmark, are both examples of third person narrative, but they're very different in the way they deploy third person narrative. So let's touch on that really quickly. So the book tells you about, maybe I could sort of, let me see, can I open? I know what to do. Sorry, I wasn't planning to do this, but let me just get something I can type on real quickly. What's going on here? Just open my Google Docs here, please, would you? What is it doing? No. What's going on here? I think my screen recorder is just making it really laggy. All right. Yeah, definitely should have had this ready to go. All right, so all this is in the handout, right? But just to make it clear, right? Third person. 200%. There we go. Third person, you have an external observer, right? But you have these different categories. So first you have the omniscient third person, right? The omniscient third person narrator is the narrator that knows everything. And specifically, see this little box is screwing me up here. It knows the thoughts and feelings of multiple characters. So you're not just inside one character's head like you are in a first-person narrative. You can see the thoughts and feelings of multiple characters, right? And then there's the restricted or the limited, which is the narrator knows the thoughts of a single character. So you're getting one character's point of view there. That's kind of like first person in a way, right? And then finally you have the objective. The narrator does not know the thoughts, the inner thoughts of any character, only what is directly observable. So these are three subcategories of third person narrative. We have omniscient third person, where the narrator knows everything about all the characters, or even just a few characters, right? More than one character. We have the limited narrator, in which you have one single main character whose perspective the narrative is filtered through. And as the book points out, that's sometimes referred to as the central consciousness. The focal character is also known as the central consciousness. That's the way it usually works, right? If you're reading like a Harry Potter novel or whatever, not that I've never read a Harry Potter novel, but I'll assume this is how it is. My son is a Percy Jackson fan. He doesn't like Harry Potter, and those books are all in the first person. But in Harry Potter, from what my experience, I've read a little bit of it, I guess. You're experiencing the events through Harry's eyes, even though it's not a first person narrative, right? He's the character whose thoughts and feelings you have privy to. That's the way most novels and most short stories work. You have that one central figure. And then there's the objective narrator, where really you just have a kind of external gaze. You only see actions and hear dialogue. You don't know anybody's thoughts or feelings. And that's how we experience life in reality, right? If you're sitting watching two people have a discussion or an argument, you only know what they're saying and what they're doing. You don't know, you're not actually inside their heads. So omniscient, limited, objective. And again, all of this is in this handout. And definitely the best way to absorb this is to read the handout. So what have we got here with our two third-person stories? Again, I'm not going to do like a close reading of both of these stories, but I just want to talk a little bit about how they're deployed, how narrative is deployed in them. So Hemingway is a very different writer than Poe or Hawthorne. He's known for his minimalism, and as you were reading this, you probably recognized just how spare the narrative was in some ways. There are things you don't get in this that you often get in the story. For example, the story begins, right? And, we meet the hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. On this side, there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between two lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station, there was the warm shadow of the building, and a curtain made of strings of bamboo beads hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. The American and the girl with him sat at a table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot, and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this juncture for 2 minutes and went on to Madrid. So I just read this first paragraph here. And of course, the main thing to notice, of course, is that our characters are the American and the girl. Now, in almost any story you read, the very first thing you learn is what? Yeah, the name of the main character, right? Bill woke up one day, or what is it? Like Kafka's Metamorphosis. Gregor Samsa awoke one morning to discover he had transformed into a hideous vermin. Identifying your character by name is one of the first things that a writer of fiction usually does. And we never get the names of our characters of the story. We get the American, and we get the girl, and then later Jig, because the American calls her Jig. Why would Hemingway not give us names? That's odd. Well, it reflects the nature of the narrator we have here, right? And you don't even have to read the story. I mean, you just look at this story, right? And what you see is an awful lot of dialogue and not very much narrative, right? Narrative being what the narrator is telling us, dialogue being what the characters are saying. This is a story that's driven almost entirely by dialogue, the two characters talking to each other. In that way, it almost kind of feels like a play, right? A lot of the narrative, in fact, is just limited to things like he said, she said, right? Or if not even that, right? So what are we not getting? We're not getting any characters' thoughts and feelings. Who's that? Somebody's knocking on my door. Come in. I'm working here. Okay. You have something to say? No. You have something to say about Ernest Hemingway? No. Okay. Just my son. Sorry about that. Work from home, right? Where was I? Oh, yes. Ernest Hemingway and the narrator in Hills Like White Elephants. So we don't get the characters' names even. We don't get what they're thinking or feeling. All we hear is what they're saying. All we know is what they're saying to each other. It's almost as if we are experiencing this story like we're sitting at the next table watching them. And maybe you've been in that situation before. You've ever been in a restaurant and like a couple tables over, there's a couple having an argument. You know, that's real life. Do you know what they're thinking? Do you know their names? No. All you know is what they're saying, and everything else has to be intuited. In fact, that even applies to the basic, subject matter of what they're talking about, because nobody ever names what it is they're discussing, right? Let's see. All we get is it's really an awfully simple operation. Okay. All of a sudden, right? The man, the American, jumps in with, "It's really an awfully simple operation, Jig," the man said. "It's not really an operation at all." The girl looked at the ground the table legs rested on. "I know you wouldn't mind it, Jig. It's really not anything. It's just to let the air in." The girl did not say anything. "I'll go with you and I'll stay with you all the time. They just let the air in and then it's perfectly natural." "Then what will we do afterward?" "We'll be fine afterward, just like we were before." "What makes you think so?" "It's the only thing that bothers us. It's the only thing that made us unhappy." The girl looked at the bead curtain, put her hand out and took hold of two of the strings of beads. "And then you think we'll be all right and happy?" "I know we will. You don't have to be afraid. I've known lots of people that have done it." "So have I," said the girl. And afterward, they were all so happy. Sarcastic, right? "Well," the man said, "if you don't want to do it, if you don't want to, you don't have to. I wouldn't have you do it if you didn't want to. But I know it's perfectly simple." What are they talking about here? It's never named, but it could only be one thing, right? What kind of operation could a boyfriend be trying to convince his girlfriend to have that to make things go back to the way they were before, as if nothing had ever happened and nothing had changed, and the girl being somewhat hesitant about it? They're obviously talking about an abortion. No one ever says the word abortion, but characteristic of the way this story is written, we as readers are left to intuit it from the details of their from the facts of their conversation, right? Just as we would if we were listening to it in real life, if we were sort of eavesdropping on it. So what kind of narrator do we have here then? Class? No thoughts and feelings, very limited description of the basic stuff you would get in most stories, like the characters' names and the backgrounds and what they did before they got here, etc. No idea what's going on inside their heads, except to the extent that we can figure it out from what they're saying. That's right. This is an objective narrator, right? This is a narrator who only tells you what is externally observable. And if you go back to the book, right? Finally, an objective narrator, here we go. An objective narrator does not explicitly report the character's thoughts and feelings, but may obliquely suggest them through the character's speech and actions, which is exactly what we have here. Stories with objective narrators consist mostly of dialogue interspersed with minimal description. Again, fits Hemingway's story to a T. In fact, I have a sneaking suspicion that the Norton Anthology anthologizes this story for that very reason, because it is the textbook example of an objective narrator. All right. I don't want this video to go on too long, so let's hop on over to the birthmark. And what do we have here? There's a lot to say about the birthmark, But for now, I'm just going to focus on the question of its narrative style, right? The birthmark. This is a story in which a lot of things besides narrative are important, right? Especially symbolism, which is something I'll probably drop some information about next time. Symbolism, right? We have this birthmark. It clearly represents something larger than itself, some larger abstraction or idea. The very idea of human imperfection, what it means to be a human being. Leave all that aside for a second, all right? Because you guys are smart, you can figure this out. And the birthmark is a story that really wears its theme on its sleeve, right? It doesn't take too much sleuthing to figure out what Hawthorne is getting at in the story. But how about the question of narrative? I haven't taken a look at all the critical responses yet, so I'm curious to see what you guys came up with. But let me just point something out to you, right? Let's pick one line, a moment of dialogue here, right? There's a few different things we could look at, but... All right. So on page, what page is this? Oh, shoot, there's no page numbers. There really no page numbers? 1, 2, 3. It's the third page. Yeah. All right. This is the section, chunk I want to deal with here. Late one night, when the lights were growing dim, so as hardly to betray the stain on the poor wife's cheek, she herself, for the first time, voluntarily took up the subject. "Do you remember, my dear Aylmer," said she, with a feeble attempt at a smile, "have you any recollection of a dream last night about this odious hand?" "None whatever," replied Aylmer, starting, but then he added, in a dry, cold tone, affected for the sake of concealing the real depth of his emotion, "I might well dream of it, for before I fell asleep it had taken a pretty firm hold of my fancy." "And you did dream of it," continued Georgiana, hastily, for she dreaded lest a gush of tears should interrupt what she had to say. "A terrible dream. I wonder that you can forget it. Is it possible to forget this one expression? It is in her heart now. We must have it out. Reflect, my dear husband, for by all means I would have you recall that dream." So this is a moment in the text where the two characters are discussing a dream that Aylmer had, and she knows about it because he was talking in his sleep. But what I want to focus on is what the narrator is telling us between snippets of dialogue. All right. So we have dialogue, which is in the stuff in quotation marks, right? And then we've got the narrative, which is the stuff where the narrator is speaking. Now, check this out. I think you'll figure this out pretty quickly, but check this out. She's like, did you have a dream about my birthmark last night, about the odious hand, right? She's got this hand-shaped birthmark on her cheek. And Aylmer's like, do you have any recollection? She's like, do you have any recollection? He's like, none whatever, replied. So this is him speaking. So what he says is, no, I didn't have a dream about it. But then the narrator gives us more information, right? And what does the narrator tell us about what Aylmer's thinking, or what Aylmer is motivated by, or what the thought behind his words? Replied Aylmer, starting, but then he added in a dry, cold tone. Sorry, let me highlight this. Then he added in a dry, cold tone, affected for the sake of concealing the real depth of his emotion. He added in a dry, cold tone, affected. What is the narrator telling us here? He's affecting a dry, cold tone. In other words, he's faking it. He's pretending to be cool, calm, and collected, but on the inside, his emotions are really churning. So are we seeing what's directly observable here, or are we inside Aylmer's head? Right, we're inside Aylmer's head. You can't know this without the narrator telling you, right? You can't know this just for sure, without, just by hearing what he's saying. But there are the words he speaks, and there's the stuff going on inside his head. So we know we're not objective here. The question then is, do we have a central consciousness, one main character, which would make this a limited narrator, or are we inside every character's head? And then right in the next paragraph, goes back to Georgiana. "And you did dream of it," continued Georgiana hastily. Let me just highlight the narrative here. Continued Georgiana hastily, for she dreaded lest a gush of tears should interrupt what she had to say. Now, this sort of archaic language aside here, it's pretty clear what the narrator is saying. She's speaking hastily, quickly, and that's okay, something we could observe. Well, she's speaking quickly. But the reason that she's speaking quickly is something that you could only know if you know what she's thinking. And why is she speaking quickly? For she dreaded lest a gush of tears should interrupt what she had to say, because she's worried that at any minute she's going to start crying hysterically because she's so upset by the subject matter. Well, where are we? We're inside Georgiana's head. So in the space of this conversation, just going back and forth between the two characters, the narrator tells us what Aylmer's thinking. Then the narrator comes back and tells us what Georgiana is thinking. And again, these are mainly our two characters. By the way, these stories are really different. Hills and Birthmark, very different in many ways, but they're also very similar in one important way, which is that they're two stories about a couple having a conflict, right? When Georgiana and Aylmer argue, the difference though is that the narrator tells us Aylmer's thinking this, Georgiana's thinking this. Here's what they're saying, here's what they're thinking. So what kind of narrator is that, my friends, who's inside the heads of both characters? That's right. Omniscient. Omniscient, right? Omniscient is just a Greek word, or is it Latin? Omniscient. I'm going to go with Latin for now. Yeah, scire is the Latin word to know. So omni means everything, right? To know everything. The narrator can see the thoughts and feelings of multiple characters. All right. So there you have it. 3 different kinds of narrative, and they all work for the two stories. They work well for the stories. There's a purpose to them as well, right? They affect the way we experience the story. But here you have the example of first-person narrative with Cask of Amontillado, third-person objective with Hills Like White Elephants, and third-person omniscient with The Birthmark. Okay, let's stop here for now. For next week, you'll see me reveal. I'll enjoy your Memorial Day weekend. At some point on Monday afternoon, I will unveil the next reading, and so it will be The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. A great story, one of my favorites. So if you want to get the jump on it, but those are the basics of narrative as it applies to these 3 stories that we've read so far. And we'll talk a little bit more about things like symbolism and theme next week. But anyway, it's good to touch base with all of you. I hope you're doing okay and you're all staying safe. Don't go too crazy, Memorial Day weekend. Stay away from crowded beaches. Hopefully one day we'll all be back on campus again. But for now, this is what we've got. So email me, drop me a note if you need to talk about anything. We'll continue with the assignments next week and building towards our first essay. But goodbye for now and enjoy the weekend, okay? All right. How do I stop this thing? Here we go. Stop. Bye.